Pause.
I recognize.
I got it. There is another person in the waiting room. Here we go. Admit. Very good. So, good evening, everyone. And welcome to the third installment, Jewish Law Seminar. This is the third and final class of our survey of the historical sources regarding abortion in Jewish law. As I had mentioned from the outset, it said abortion and privacy on the title. Privacy is really a topic that doesn't come into the discussion about abortion in Jewish law. It wasn't the basis from which we made any halachic decisions, and therefore, as I mentioned at the outset, we weren't going to really deal with it. It's a topic for a different day. We might even look at how privacy developed as a concept in American law. And I just wanted to say, to give a little credence to the fact that I chose to include it in the title. Privacy really goes from the realm of property law in the United States to the realm of the individual, thinking about the individual and his or her rights within the 20th century. And Justice Douglas is central to that endeavor of thinking about what privacy really means. And Shelley Adler, our member, has one of the great law review articles in the Yale Law Review about privacy and the doctrine of privacy, and Justice Douglas's conception that it really did take into account the individual's right for self-actualization. And I think what we've seen over time is both a recognition of self-actualization, that is a woman's right to that, and even the recognition that a fetus will one day actualize. And I think in terms of what we've noticed about halachic literature, it's safe to say that more inclusion of women's selves could have been part of the halachic materials, the halachic shuvot, the responsa that we looked at. And over time, she does play a larger role in considering whether or not the termination of a pregnancy is warranted. And that development over time of the woman's place as a central actor within the decision-making process actually comes to light starting in about the 18th century. And I'm going to review tonight the sources that are the pinnacle sources or the cornerstone type of sources to get to our more permissive position on abortion in the Jewish community. And I'm going to start us back with that source from the 18th century and another one from the 18th century that brought us into the landscape of a more permissive approach to abortions when poskim were asked the questions. Those tshuvot will make evident some of Judaism's inside or baseball kind of halachic mechanisms in order to permit abortions. There'll also be evidence of what's happening in social history and medical history in a way that law and the cases that are reported in law are really a record sometimes of history. Then I'm going to move us from those permissive sources, because they are quoted by poskim who will come later. I'm going to move us into the 20th century. We touched on the 20th century the last time we met. So we're going to go from foundational early modern sources to the 20th century. We're going to see tonight a 20th century source and remind ourselves about the great 20th century source that Rabbi, we call him the Tzitz Eliezer, and his name is Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg. We're going to review the list he made of sources and how he read the sources to be quite permissive. We're going to see that inside. We touched on that when it came to rape and incest, that he was permissive in those cases last time when Dale asked her question. We'll see how certain poskim followed up and used Rabbi Waldenberg's responsum as their base to be permissive. But then, if you're following my little outline for tonight, we're going to put the brakes on. We're going to ask who put the brakes on and why. And what does it make evident? And then we're going to say, do we only see that we put the brakes on? Or does someone step on the gas and say, wait a minute, we're forgetting the woman in this picture? And how do we interpret those sources? Do we only read them like we used to in terms of permissibility? Or is there a new way to read them? And then in the end of the class, I'm going to take us back. If we started with Torah, and I gave you a narrative about the sacredness of life among our ancestors, I'm going to show you a place of narrative or midrash within the Talmud to end, because what we do here in the Beit Midrash is Talmud Torah. So we started with Torah, and then we're going to get to the Talmud, and we're going to cap it off tonight with a piece of Talmud that indeed kind of reflects on just what's the status of a fetus, and given the status of a fetus, how does that continue to help us refine our positions, our thinking about termination of pregnancies and abortion? So we got a lot to get through, but I wanted you to know where we're going and what we're going to do tonight. So the first foray back into the subject matter, this is on Sefaria, on my Sefaria website. Someone mentioned to me today that he was thinking about an issue regarding the Torah and a tree of life, and happened to be Googling and searching and found my Sefaria source sheet on tree of life. So that was nice. Some of my sheets are public and some of my sheets are private. Those who use Sefaria always thank the Sefaria learning community, and I'm thanking aloud the Sefaria learning community because some people had abortion sources already organized in another Sefaria source sheet, and I am the beneficiary of learning through about 8 or 10 of them. And I'm also adding, in terms of being a good participating community member, I'm adding a bunch of these sources to the Sefaria site by including them on my own source sheet buildup, by actually sitting and entering them, whether I'm entering them in the Hebrew or a translation. And I've added now several more sources so that if someone building one of these kinds of source sheets wants to come along and use some of the source material that I've entered, like from the sages we will learn tonight a little bit later who were not in the system yet, they will have these available to them, especially the 20th century way that I'm going to explicate what happened in terms of putting the brakes on abortion for all at any time for any woman and why that was, but then what happened after that. Okay, so here we go through the source sheet. The permissive point of view. If you recall, it was Rabbi Jacob Emden, that is in Shelat Yavitz, questions answered by the Yavitz, that's his call name, if you will. He in 1739 to 59 wrote this book, wrote these responsa. The questioner asks about an adulterous married woman who is pregnant, and it's a good question. You like to be valued for your questions. Remember, there were others who were like, why are you asking me that question? You know, remember that? So it's nice to have rhetoric that includes feeling validated like a Jew who asks a good question. It appears to me to permit her to abort. And even in the case of a legitimate fetus, there is reason to be lenient if there is a great need, as long as the fetus has not begun to emerge. What Mishnah was that? Now we're all kind of in the world of abortion sources. That was a Mishnah in Ohalot. Tense. What happens underneath the tent? If I encounter a dead body, am I impure? Am I pure? What happens to the vessels in my tent? What's going on here with life and times as it's lived by families? So you had this Mishnah about a woman's scenario in a case of abortion, case of terminating the pregnancy, even up to the last minute before the head comes out. We say her life before the fetus's life, noting that the fetus was called Chai, a life, as Matt had noticed, and noticing that the terminology changes once the head comes out to Nefesh. We then got into a whole discussion. Wait a minute, is there a status change? Is a Chai the same as a Nefesh? Nefesh, the word, really did connote full status as a human being under the law, about which capital code would apply, so that you could charge a capital crime if something was to happen to that nefesh in the mother's womb. But if it's called a chai and not a nefesh, then I might be able to say I can't charge a capital crime against someone who takes the life of the chai, of the life that's inside the mother's womb. And what indeed did we say the life really represented, the word chai? That it was the potential life that we know could be a potential life if it was born into the world like a regular birth, or we helped it come out. But since it was part of the mother's body, you could say more expansively and interpretively, it wasn't necessarily a full nefesh yet. All that's in the background, and Rabbi Emden knows it. And here he's saying, when there's a great need, as long as the fetus has not begun to emerge, even if the mother's life is not in jeopardy, but only so as to save her from an evil associated with it, that would cause her great pain. Now, that's a very permissive stance in 17, let's say, somewhere between 39 and 59. We didn't have just the mother's physical body being challenged. We're now saying life is in jeopardy because there's an evil associated with it that would cause her great pain. Who judges what's evil? So it sounds like we have to understand from her. What's going on here? And we indeed do. We see that modern times calls for a different consciousness, a different engagement with the woman who is facing what might occur. Now, I brought you again Rabbi Yehuda ibn Ayash of Algiers in his responsa, Simon 14, and he's writing in 1740. I was asked and searched my heart, my intellect, to examine and explore what I had heard about a small group of women who become pregnant and don't want to give birth again. This is a women's group. This is a community. This is a clutch of women. This is a representation of women's voices in history in our people and among our people. This is a group of women expressing their will. What do they want, and who do not want to remain pregnant anymore once they had already conceived? Now, for some reason, they conceived. Let's do it's kind of like we want to apply the Occam's razor law and not make up too many stories in order to interpret a text as simply as we can. But let me tell you, what is he really meaning? Maybe he means that they were using a contraceptive sponge, which sometimes was allowable by Talmudic passages that we didn't study, but I'm just telling you that they understood sometimes that they were trying to take measures to have contraceptive means because they knew some women, it was dangerous to their health to get pregnant, that they still wanted to allow pleasure between the man and the woman. There could be another case here where they knew that her milk would dry up as it was, right? Because we read about other sources, the milk would dry up if she was pregnant. We now know it doesn't, but okay, what's going to happen though if she's too taxed physically is really the issue, and they might allow for an abortion if she conceived. We know that they believed in some places and most you couldn't conceive during that time of nursing, but we know she can. So all these things play in to what's going on. And maybe they just really started to think about family planning in a deep way here, which is evident within the responsum. And some of these women, if they become pregnant while nursing another child, They suspect the ayin hara, or danger of the new birth to the living child, and they may make a medication and drugs that are known to them to terminate a child, and he will become a nefel, a non-viable fetus. Here, in the case of the women of this tshuva, there is suspicion about the pregnancy, and its potential for harm is acknowledged, and women are therefore permitted to ingest this medication. Now, this was radical too, because it was not only permissive about the woman and her situation, but who was read into the case? The children, the child. And so for reasons of family reality, we have a permissive stance already in the 18th century. And the conceptions of women really play into the decision-making process of the halakhist. Now, it sounds also just like they absolutely knew how to create the abortifacient or the abortifacient. They knew the recipe for creating the right medication for this process. It wasn't that they had to go in and do the invasive procedure. And there are recipe books. Someone asked me about that, whether or not they had such knowledge and it was shared and one needed to go to some medical school for it. Well, the communities kept books of certain types of quote unquote folk remedies. These were remedies that remedied this problem. And so it was allowable. And obviously it was going on in the Rav's community. And so the tshuva makes available to us a commentary on what's happening within women's history, what's going on within medical history. And behold, we have before us exactly what everyone acknowledges is an acceptable situation where an abortion would be permitted, to illustrate the danger to the living child, and the mother is permitted to drink an abortive drug, so it seems, according to my understanding of the issue. Now, in 1913, we get a few other commentators. I'm now getting us to the 20th century based on some of those 18th century sources and beyond. In 1913, we had someone say, mental health risk has been definitely equated with physical health risk. Now, mind you, there's a great history of when Jews start to become involved, associated with, and conscious of mental health as an area of care and investigation and endeavor as a way of saying that we have mental health to take care of as much as physical health. If you would mute yourselves, I hear fuzz and static coming through now and then. If you would just make
Yeah.
It's too late.
Oh no.
Yeah, last one 6:30.
Miranda, I think I hear you.
8.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So, when it comes to thinking about the 20th century and how they've relied on these sources above, they kind of summarize the notion of what some of the experiences of those folks who asked the questions about it were really having. They think about the experience of the women and what kind of situations they face. They think about the stress, the mental stress, in addition to the physical danger that's happening. And so that is Rabbi Mordechai Winkler. Rabbi Ben-Zion Chai Uziel in Mishpatei Uziel, 47 to 64, he is a very important Rav. I forget, I just want to look quickly where he's from. Rabbi Uziel. Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, sometimes is rendered, he's sometimes called just Uziel, was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Mandatory Palestine from 1939 to 1948, and of Israel from 48 until his death in 53. So not a insignificant someone. And he says, it is clear that abortion is not permitted without reason. That would be destructive and frustrative of the possibility of life. But for a reason, even if it's for a slim reason, such as to prevent disgrace, then we have precedent and authority to permit it. Remember what the disgrace issues were? A woman has a baby in an adulterous relationship. She's going to be disgraced. The baby is going to be a mamzer. And therefore, I have to allow for this child to be aborted because there's such disgrace about to happen from both mother's side and child side, family dynamics as well. I've got to be permissive. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, as I mentioned, is the someone upon whom we rely for a very significant source of our ability to paskin permissively, to make halachic decisions that allow for, that permit, that broaden the scope of for whom we can make this procedure accessible, permissible, and thusly support, even, again, this is one of those Gemaras we looked at, Jewish experts at this procedure doing it for the sake of a woman, a child, a family, and in general, under the Torah's mandate and Torah law, our understanding of it. If there is a danger to the mother from continuing the pregnancy, one should permit abortion without hesitation. Also, if her health is poor, and to cure her or to relieve her from great pain, it is necessary to abort the fetus, even if she is not in actual danger. There is room to permit it, based on the halachic authority's evaluation of the situation. Now, what he does do, just by way of halachic parlance and history, is he says, you really need to consult with a halachist. You want to live your life within the framework. He makes evident that that is a position of someone who believes deeply that halachic guidelines should guide your decision regarding your termination of pregnancy. But he says that it's not about the immediate danger. Why is he saying it's not about the immediate danger in 1967? Because there are those who would say and read our Mishnah that we went through, the Mishnah from Ohalot. Remember the Mishnah? The mother and the baby and the fetus and her life before his, her life before hers, and you do everything until the head comes out? Well, if I read that very narrowly, and I say that only applies in a case where the woman is truly threatened, her life is in the balance, and therefore Judaism only allows for an abortion when her life is truly in the balance, then otherwise, what's it saying about abortion, about terminating pregnancies? That I have to be very careful when I permit this. If her life is what is the deciding factor, if I don't rule like some of those other authorities who we just saw, that it's even for an evil that's perceived, that could be, even for the disgrace that might come of this to a family, a woman, even for the disgrace that is thrust on the woman who was raped and for whom we allow an abortion, because there are other sources I didn't show you that would say just that. And by the way, there are not many, as I mentioned last week, that really deal with that because, frankly, this is the way you have to read that. Well, why are there no major questions about this? Because people would get it done and they would do it anyway. Call them reform, call them conservative, call them orthodox, in whatever lane of living the way they lived as Jews in the past was really happening, like looking back and wanting to own them, kind of in retrospect, given our goggles today. Obviously, these things didn't exist until a certain time in Europe and a certain time in America. But regardless of their lane as a Jew, how observant or how non-observant they were, what we conclude from that in terms of looking at halachic literature is that if there wasn't a lot of question, there's not a lot of question. It was basically not only permitted, but it wasn't even discussed in order not to put the real stop or brakes on it. And it was obvious in these answers that we've seen, even the small amounts of them that I'm showing you, that ending pregnancies, terminating pregnancies was really happening. And it was heightened to such a level as to really be a question within and among Jews as to whether or not this was legal, that some of the cases were brought before the major decisors of our era, of each era, in order to decide and discuss and to extrapolate the principled approach behind doing this, what is available to women and families to end pregnancies. So that is going to lead us to, in the shortest form, to let me tell you that this is the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which is a part of the conservative movement. This is Cass Abelson's language. There is clear precedent in the tradition to permit abortion of a fetus to save a mother's life, to safeguard her health, or even for a very thin reason, such as to spare her physical pain or mental anguish. So that's a very permissive view in the 1980s, reflective of a society that has a very large group of not only everyday non-Americans, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, right? Let's say that there was a smaller group of nuns at that time in the 1980s, but probably as many who didn't really ascribe to one or another religious faith and think they had to ask religious leaders their opinions about what was going on, probably even a larger group, including, very liberal religionists. And this is an expression of that attitude within society. This is also an expression of sources we've learned together, and halakhic sources we've learned together that are not only from the liberal movements, but you saw, and we just reviewed, that they were there in the 18th century as they began to summarize the sources that came before them that are considered the foundational sources of how we approach the issues. The Exodus passage, the Mishnah in Ohalot, the passage from the Rambam that used a construct of Jewish law but didn't actually apply the whole notion of this is a real individual person for whom capital crime status could be thrust onto the one who did the abortion and who's to do the abortion, and how do we make this accessible, safe, and right, and is it only for the safety of the mother, or is it even beyond? And it's for that beyond scenarios that we included, mental health included. And in the 80s, you see, slight reasons allow us to be supportive of abortions in general. And if this was going to inform our thinking in general, because we're interested as Jews in how our thinking impacts social policy and not just our own family situations, one might, with the interpretation of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, have thought as a good conservative Jew, looking at this again from social religious history, hey, we really have good reason, for even slight reasons, to support abortion in our nation. And we might sense that that's the way that Jewish opinion really allows for our community to get behind a more permissive abortion policy in America. And that is one way you could go. But I want you to note that Rabbi Aharon Lichtenstein, again, he's a colleague of some of the other colleagues whose questions and answers we have looked at. So there's not like he represents the Orthodox position. There are many other Orthodox positions we just looked at before we got to the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards sentence summary there from Cass Abelson. But Lichtenstein is going to say the following. Here it is clear that saving a life is not the only sanction for permitting an abortion. This is evident from the Talmudic passage that permits a nursing mother to cohabitate using a moch. That's the barrier of cotton or wool to prevent pregnancy. So here it sounds like he's got the contraception on his mind. Since this prohibition is waived to facilitate normal family relations, which is why the omission in this context is not wasteful. In other words, you might think that if we were to allow contraception, I would say that it's spilling of seed, which is against the Torah law. That's just, I'm now bringing you inside some of the halachic discourse that's going on in short form. Since it would follow that other ethical and humane factors may also be taken into account. it would seem to me that issues such as kavod habriot, dignity of persons, shalom bayit, domestic peace, and sa'ar, pain, which all carry significant halachic weight in other contexts, should be considered in making these decisions. So there's some more psychological dimension of what poskim are at least thinking about when it comes to making decisions. And so if you're not going to just be blanket permissive within orthodoxy, you have Rabbi Lichtenstein to say, oh, I have lots of categories to consider about a woman's shaila, a woman's question about whether or not this is permitted to me. Is it not only the classic ones we've looked at throughout Jewish history in the way we read the Mishnah, her life before its life, before the fetus's life? I have also domestic peace to take into consideration. Is there shalom bayit in terms of this decision that I could help create? Is there dignity to the people involved? Dignity to the woman, dignity to the family, dignity to the unborn fetus that might have dignity issues coming out? Tsa'ar, will there be excessive pain in the birth? Will there be excessive pain in a disease that she's about to experience because of the issue or the disease the baby has? And when it comes to something like what we could know about Tay-Sachs and what it might lead to in the very near future for a child and the parents suffering through the death of a child, these kinds of things are what allow, Rabbi Lichtenstein is what allows for those considerations. And as we become better and better at diagnosing these kinds of situations and what may be experienced as we become more expert in the psychological impact of these things and the physical manifestations of not only symptoms, but of end result, unfortunately, deaths, premature deaths of all types, then what we see is that we have a very open discussion and a quite permissive foundation when it comes to approaching the questions of terminating pregnancies. So that's where we are. You could say it was that way and is that way in the 20th century, but I don't want you to miss, and I can't present the topic without saying that in the 20th century, there was a moment of putting on the brakes for that type of what sounds like openness and permissiveness within the discourse of Jews and abortion, Jews and terminating pregnancies. And I'm going to bring you into a case study of the WHO makes a very deep difference within attitudes within the Jewish community based on his halachic writings and not just a tshuva, not just a responsum. Because what happens in 20th century America probably has precedence in the 18th and 19th century that we could go through in a literary form if we were taking a class together on the form of halachic analysis in article form versus case law form. And when did articles about halacha start to get written in a more kind of academic way? And what impact do they have on the practice and the general understandings of Jews versus just individual shoot literature, she'ela tshuva, responsum literature? Okay, so that's a different issue. Put it aside for a second. I have an article from the 20th century that is going to present for us that halachic case in the sense that there was this article written by a very significant Jewish legal expert and medical ethicist. One could say he even started the entire realm of Jewish medical ethics, and he fundamentally changed the conversation about abortion and Jews. And so we're gonna go there in a second. Let me stop the share for now, though. Did I lose my spotlight? I might have lost my spotlight. So I'm gonna put myself. I'm gonna add a pin.
You are still spotlighted.
I'm still spotlighted?
Yep.
Oh, on my screen, I just don't see myself. So let me remove that pin. I think I'm going to go to my gallery view, though. Yeah, there I am. Okay, good. So I got the gallery in front of me, folks. Nice to see everybody again. And let me also invite any, right now, I'll stop here for questions and clarifications. or some comments that you have before we get on to the next section. Yes, Matt, in the Beit Midrash here.
Just a little question. Where the 1913 Teshuvah, where was that rabbi located?
That Rav,
Winkler. Yeah, I don't know.
I believe that he wrote that when he was in America. I want to believe that he wrote that when he was in America. I can check that out, but I don't have his the place where that sefer was. Levushe Mordechai is his commentary. Other questions, comments at this point? Gone. Okay, so here we go. Let me take you into this next realm. Now, like I said, it seems like we have agreement among all parties to the halachic discourse that we're in the mode of being very permissive, that we're in the mode of understanding that even though you could read the Mishnah very narrowly, a woman's situation is to be taken into account, her physical health, her mental health, her understanding that evil might befall her, a sense that this is not right, family welfare, the welfare of other children, the situation of the community and how they'll treat this family. All these things are lining up. To remind ourselves what's happening in America and in Britain. There is a rabbi who becomes very instrumental to this discussion. We say that he was one who began the field of Jewish medical ethics, and his name is Rabbi Emmanuel Jacobits. Okay, so who's heard of Emmanuel Jacobits? You might have heard of him. He was a medical ethicist. He wrote a lot about medical issues and Talmudic and Torah passages. He collected so much thinking about different medical issues and put them into now article forms and not just direct responses to people within his community. He was the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth of Great Britain from 67 to 91. Prior to this, he had served as chief rabbi of Ireland and rabbi of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue in New York City. So he was quite an established individual, very familiar with the Western world, very familiar with Western culture. And what winds up happening with the Rav is that he first writes about the sources that we've studied. So you could sit down with Rabbi Jacobits and you could have an informed conversation because you've studied exactly the sources that he's studied about abortion, about terminating pregnancies. And at first, because he's interested in giving you the spirit of Jewish law, he tells you the only place that they deal with it in Torah is Exodus, and it seems like over there they're really dealing with tort law, and that comes to show that it's not really an individual defined by Jewish law as full human, and that's because women are so essential. But then there are other sources. One seems to say it's just part of her body, but another seems to say, wait a minute, we take seriously the notion of a fetus so as to break the Sabbath. And if we need to even do some procedure to save the fetus, we break the Sabbath as if the moil comes to do the bris on the Sabbath. And doesn't that argue for the fact that we think that this life is not just part of her body? We think that it's obviously a nefesh at that point. And so we're going to actually take the baby out. But it's not really clear, says the Rav in his first go around, mid-century, 20th century. It's not really clear what Judaism is trying to completely say. And there are many, many poskim based on the Mishnah in Ohalot that kind of say, we see that there's this statement that a woman's life is really precedental, that her life is more important than the life of the fetus. And you would be saying, oh, do you have any other sources that I didn't learn yet in the Jewish law seminar at Or Zarua? And the answer would be, we're all able to talk about what this topic really makes reference to in terms of the halakhic understandings we have with the sources that you guys have basically reviewed in the Beit Midrash. And the only other one that I can bring you, he would say, is a commentary by Philo of Alexandria. And you know what Philo of Alexandria said? Philo of Alexandria, well, I think that I should wait for a second, and we should think about abortion in not only the great canon of sources that you studied, but with Philo as an equal to the source collection that you've really brought forward. And let me tell you why I think Philo of Alexandria is such an important commentator. And what is he doing? He's hedging a little, because he knows that he's about to bring you a source that argues for the exact opposite of everything else that Jewish sources really presented regarding the issue. He's going to use that source over time, over a couple decades worth of time, to align himself with a much more small c, conservative, large E, evangelical community in America, because of the decline of culture and what he believes the challenge really is to the social mores of our country and the Western world. And he's going to use Philo to say that Philo of Alexandria, who was the Jew, went right along with how our brethren translated and read this. And that is when the Septuagint, remember, the Greek translation, which was used by the church fathers, remember that they said if a baby with any kind of form comes out of the mother when two men are fighting, then it's going to be a capital murder case, because what just came out of the mother in that Exodus source is a full-fledged human being, a life. Remember that? Philo, our own Philo, he would say, the Jewish guy who was kind of sitting right alongside the rabbis and the other source makers all this time over these thousands of years. Philo's source is as important to us as any of the other sources that you learned and studied. And I'm going to really bring that home now that we have some perspective years later, decades later, even though in my first article, I didn't raise him as the source I'm really going to hang my hat on. I only mention him by the wayside there to tell you that that's how the church really had interpreted things. It's not exactly the Jewish read, and the Jewish read is kind of not exactly so clear. You might read it more narrowly, like you only save her when there's a real danger to her life. You might read it more expansively, as other halachists have throughout history. Philo, by the way, I hold at that time in my hands to understand why the Christian majority in America might say what they say based on a biblical interpretation, that you really just took a life when you caused a miscarriage, or you are going to now take a life when you abort. And he's going to, because of the morality factors involved with his perspective about society's decline, raise the Philo source as the source for Jews to turn against the tide of permissibility and interpret it as if you were taking the life within life. Getting back to Genesis 9, which says when a person takes the life within a person, in other words, an independent life is inside the mother's womb. When a person takes the life of a person, by another person shall his blood be shed. In other words, the law must come to demand retribution. That was a radical move by a halachist, even in the face of other Orthodox contemporaries who maintained a more permissive stance, a more flexible read of sources, and a willingness to not come out with articles that talked about the Jewish position and deal with things case by case, as poskim really should. I guess I'm editorializing when I say should. But let's just talk about halachic history again, and people coming out with articles that seem to present the stance of halakhah. But we're too informed now to just accept his assertion, which I'm going to read to you parts of his assertions now from the inside. Because after the 1950s article that he wrote, that kind of still said that Judaism's a little bit unclear, given all those sources we've studied, or Zerua. And given Philo of Alexandria said all of this, and he was grappling with it for 15, 18 years now, he winds up writing an article called Jewish Views on Abortion that is found in volume 17, issue 480 of the Case Western Reserve Law Review. And that is an article called Jewish Views on Abortion. Emmanuel Jacobits. And here is a presentation of some of the elements of that article, which will not read like those tshuvot we saw earlier this evening. Okay, before I read on, let me make sure, I see Ari and I see Shelly Sapoznik. Can you tell me that you see the screen, and on the bottom of the screen it says putting on the brakes? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, good. All right, excellent. And you hear me fine, and I'm spotlighted? Is that true? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the check-in. Putting on the brakes. Because of timing, I'm going down to Rabbi Jacobits. Here we go. Jewish Views on Abortion, 1965. He reviews some sources. He brings you into the halachic understandings. And then he says, if we allow abortion to be completely legal in America, it's going to lead to an exponential number of terminations of pregnancies, and not of pregnancies that are going to be pregnancies with deformed children, and not pregnancies that are going to be about mothers really in pain, and not mothers who are going to even be really in psychological pain, real psychological pain, and not even women who are worried about the evil of having momsers or having children who are going to be called bastards, because the world is just going that direction. People just want to use this as birth control. Out of the 3 million pregnancies that would probably be terminated every year, no more than 30,000, that 42 is a footnote, no more than 30,000 would have resulted in deformed births. He's sensitive to the fact that there might have been some question about deformed children. While the remaining 99% would have been healthy children, had their mothers been allowed or forced to carry them to term. Subtract from this latter figure the number of mothers whose hazards would be minimized if they did not feel compelled to resort to clandestine operations, and one would still have only a relatively minute proportion of abortions that would be fully justified for the reasons advanced by the advocates of liberalization. This is Rabbi Jacobits, former rabbi of Fifth Avenue Synagogue, chief rabbi of the Commonwealth of Ireland. I mean, this is the beginning of Jewish medical ethics, respected for his medical ethics writings. Well over 95%, if not 98% of all abortions would eliminate normal children of healthy mothers. In fact, as for the mothers, the increased recourse to abortion, even if performed by qualified physicians, far from reducing hazards, would increase them, since such operations leave at least 5% of the women sterile, not to mention the rise in the resultant mortality rate. This is, he was writing back in 1965, remember, and using whatever statistics he had. One can certainly ask if the extremely limited reduction in the number of malformed children and maternal mortality risks really justify the annual wholesale destruction of 3 million germinating healthy lives, most of them potentially happy and useful citizens, especially in a country as underpopulated as America, compared to Europe, for instance, which commands far fewer natural resources. Now he goes into what will be a very different kind of approach here about the topic than other poskim had even broached. The individual's claim to life, these numerical facts alone make nonsense of the argument for more and easier abortions. But moral norms cannot be determined by numbers. So even though I've pointed out to you lots of the numbers issues about why we should be wary, let me turn to a different moral issue. In the Jewish view, he who saves one life is as if he saved an entire world. That's also a Mishnah from Sanhedrin. One human life is as precious as 1,000,000 lives, for each is infinite in value. Hence, even if that ratio were reversed and there was only a 1% chance that the child to be aborted would be normal, in fact, the chances invariably exceed 50% in any given case, the consideration for that one child in favor of life would outweigh any counterindication for the other 99%. But in truth, such a counterindication too is founded on fallacious premises. Assuming one were 100% certain, perhaps by radiological evidence, that a child would be born deformed, could this affect its claim to life? Any line to be drawn between normal and abnormal beings determining their right to live would have to be altogether arbitrary. Would grave defect in one limb or in two limbs, or an anticipated subnormal intelligence quotient of 75 or 50 make the capital difference between one who is entitled to live and one who is not? And if the absence of two limbs deprives a person of his claim to life, what about one who loses two limbs in an accident? By what moral reasoning can such a defect be a lesser cause for denying the right to live than a similar congenital abnormality? Surely life and death verdicts cannot be based on such tenuous distinctions. Illegitimate children. Now, this is like, again, I told you in the advertisement for the class, be ready to deal with opinions other than the ones you think Judaism either holds or you hold. This is one of those. Similar considerations apply to children conceived by rape. The circumstances of such a conception cannot have any bearing on the child's title to life. Put that in quotes. This is one of our Rabbanim, this is before the great right to life phraseology is completely created in the American debate. It looks like an article from Rabbi Jacobits takes on this title to life rhetoric, which begets right to life rhetoric. Now, how and where it's used entirely, I have not made a study, but it's pointed out by several scholars that there are a few voices that offered that kind of terminology into the American scene and society, and Rabbi Jacobits' voice is among them. So if you didn't think the Jews had a stake in both sides of the debate. This is the place to gain understanding. Because now, for the child of a rape, he's saying you might steal its title to life if you allow an abortion. And in the absence of any well-grounded challenge to this title to life, there cannot be any moral justification for an abortion. Once again, the burden rests with society to relieve an innocent mother, if she so desires, from the consequences of an unprovoked assault upon her virtue, if the assailant cannot be found and forced to discharge this responsibility to his child. In the case of pregnancies resulting from incestuous, adulterous, and otherwise illegitimate relations, which the mother did not resist, there are additional considerations militating against any sanction of abortion. Jewish law not only puts an extreme penalty on incest and adultery, but also imposes fearful disabilities on the products of such unions. It brands those relations as capital crimes, and it debars children born under these conditions from marriage with anyone except their like. And thusly we have what he calls the deterrent effect. The moral code to him is what will keep people from doing those crimes. Why exact such a price from innocent children for the sins of their parents? The answer is simple: to serve as a powerful deterrent to such hideous crimes. The would-be partners to any such illicit sexual relations are to be taught that their momentary pleasure would be fraught with the most disastrous consequences for any children they might conceive. Through this knowledge, they are to recoil from the very thought of incest or adultery with the same horror as they would from contemplating murder as a means to enjoyment or personal benefit. Murder is comparatively rare in civilized society for the very reason that the dreadful consequences have evoked this horror of the crime in the public conscience. Incest and adultery in the Jewish view are no lesser crimes, and they require the same horror as an effective deterrent. Just sharing with you his reasoning here. Public standards versus individual aberration. In line with this reasoning, Jewish law never condones the relaxation of public moral standards for the sake of saving recalcitrant individuals from even mortal offenses. A celebrated Jewish sage and philosopher of the 15th century, in connection with a question submitted to his judgment, averred that it was always wrong for a community to acquiesce in the slightest evil, however much it was hoped thereby to prevent far worse excesses by individuals. The problem he faced arose out of a suggestion that brothels for single people be tolerated as long as such publicly controlled institutions would reduce or eliminate the capital crime of marital faithlessness then rampant. His unequivocal answer was, it is surely far better that individuals should commit the worst offenses and expose themselves to the gravest penalties than publicly to promote the slightest compromise with the moral law. Conclusion. This review may be fittingly concluded with a reference to the very first Jewish statement on deliberate abortion. Commenting on the Septuagint version of the above quoted Exodus passage, that is the passage about the miscarriage that we make reference to in Exodus as the only one that deals with the topic at all in the Torah, the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo, at the beginning of the current era, declared that the attacker must die if the fruit he caused to be lost was already shaped and all the limbs had their proper qualities, for that which answers to this description is a human being. Like a statue lying in a studio, requiring nothing more than to be conveyed outside. The legal conclusion of this statement, reflecting Hellenistic rather than Jewish influence, may vary from the letter of Jewish law, but its reasoning certainly echoes the spirit of Jewish law. The analogy may be more meaningful than Philo could have intended or foreseen. A classic statue by a supreme master is no less priceless for being made defective, even with an arm or a leg missing. The destruction of such a treasure, it says in the, I mistyped, cannot be warranted. So that is quite the statement. And it is quite the assertion that Philo of Alexandria has captured everything Jewish because he used the Septuagint translation, which was the authorized translation of Torah by the sages. And he'll go further to tell you how authorized it was and how every translation is an interpretation, and that the way we have translated the Torah into English sometimes allows us to bring our own understandings into the currency of our society. And he raises this other understanding of the Torah's messaging regarding this moral issue, and says, do not visit the sins of parents, the sins of society, on those children that are in the womb. And you see that his rhetoric also includes this incredible phrase, title to life, which begins and swirls with the other language going on in the 60s that he's a part of. It's written in 1965. And then he'll restate it in the 70s, that the Jewish position basically aligns with the evangelical position in America. I bring you this again as case study to say that our decisors are not of only one stripe, that they didn't all go the direction that we heard from the Tzitz Eliezer and from Cass Abelson, and that we'll hear in a moment from a different case by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, a different article and approach by our own Committee on Jewish Law and Standards from the Rabbinical Assembly, and the decisive kind of statement on the topic that I would use, or anyone in our community might use, in order to understand the Jewish outlook and our read of the sources, if a family were to come and want to take up the question halachically, is this permissible at whatever stage, the pregnancy? I bring you there it was during the 1980 to 85 period of time that these discussions ensued halachically within the Rabbinical Assembly. And David Feldman, Rabbi Feldman, said the following: in the words of Rashi, only when the fetus comes into the world is it a person. The basis then for denying capital crime status to feticide in Jewish law, even for those rabbis who may have wanted to rule otherwise, is really our understanding of our Mishnah, the one we keep referring to, and Rashi's understanding, who was not only a commentator, but a halachist. And if you recall, when we studied Rashi's Torah commentary, I also several times throughout the year brought you examples of Rashi's halachic responsa. He was an authority. His authority about this issue matters to us. It matters deeply to Rabbi Feldman, who opened his tshuvot with it, his tshuva with it. Murder of the innocent is forbidden even to save life. But with abortion removed from the category of murder, then therapeutic abortion becomes permissible and in fact mandated. Mandated why? Because a woman's life takes precedence over the potential life. In analyzing such provisions, the Talmud suggested that the reason could well be that the fetus is in the category of an aggressor. Its life is forfeit under the law, which permits killing a pursuer. That was the Rambam source we saw. There was a rodef. This pursuer or aggressor is chasing after the life of a mother, and therefore we allow for the abortion. The Talmud, however, dismisses this reasoning. Yes, we saw that in one case. It did dismiss the reasoning, since the fetus is an innocent being and since one cannot know who is pursuing whom. But in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides uses the term aggressor figuratively and gives us the framework for really assessing what is the outcome after the Gemara leaves it somewhat open. It is either inapplicable or at best superfluous because the fetus is not yet a person and murder is not involved. Some commentators of the Mishnah Torah suggest that although abortion is not technically murder, it is still so grave an offense that Maimonides resorted to the aggressor argument in order to buttress the permission for abortion. Its justification is that the fetus is at least like an aggressor. The subsequent rabbinic tradition seems to align itself either to the right in the direction of Maimonides or to the left in the direction of Rashi. In other words, that you still have to contend with the fact that in some way we are dealing with the question of whether it's murder or not at all. Like Rashi, who said there's no way it's murder because it's not a nefesh. And if you want to read Maimonides as having to really brought forward the question, is this murder? Then you have what to stand on because of Maimonides' use of the framework of law he addressed. But if you want to say he only did it as a think tank kind of exercise, as a thought exercise, to give you a way of thinking about it, then you're not really dealing with the question of is it murder at all. But poskim will go their different ways, Rabbi Feldman realizes. And there's lots of debate. The first approach can be identified especially with the late chief rabbi of Israel, Issar Unterman, who sees any abortion as akin to homicide. And so there was another early source in Israel before Jacobits who said that it's murder. And by the way, after Jacobits, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein of blessed memory would come out with a statement that it's murder. The great posek of our age. That's as opposed to the great posek, also Orthodox of our age, the Tzitz Eliezer, who people rely on, and others who we have looked at as well, who say it has to be decided case by case, and Jewish sources are indeed permissive, not only physical danger, but that mental and the evil and the psychological, all of it. But Rabbi of Israel Unterman saw abortion as akin to homicide and therefore allowable only in cases of corresponding gravity, such as saving the life of the mother. So if it is even homicide and he is a pursuer, then I could still even rule that there's certain times when he's forfeited his life under the law. This approach then builds down from that strict position to embrace a broader interpretation of life-saving situations. So it's not all or nothing, even in that case, which include a threat to her health, for example, as well as a threat to her life. But Rabbi Jacobits read it in extremis, going back to the spirit of what Philo of Alexandria says, and that became the normative read about right to life, title to life. The second approach is associated with another former chief rabbi of Israel, Ben Zion Uziel, we saw earlier, and others, assumes that no real prohibition against abortion exists, and builds up from this lenient position to safeguard against indiscriminate abortion. This includes the example of Rabbi Yair Bachrach in the 17th century, whose classic responsum saw no legal bar to abortion, but would not permit it in the case before him. The case was one of a pregnancy conceived in adultery. The woman in deep remorse wanted to destroy the fruit of her sin. Now, even though that was turned on its head later on, only decades later on, which we learned inside, if you recall, there is a mention of his not allowing an abortion here in the case where it was just to relieve adultery. The author concludes by refusing to sanction the abortion not on legal grounds, but on sociological ones as a safeguard against further immorality. Other authorities disagreed on this point, affirming the legal sanction of abortion for the woman's welfare, whether life or health, or even avoidance of great pain. And that further definition of when we are permissive informs Rabbi Feldman's view and informs our modern view if you don't go the direction of to the right of Maimonides and towards it's always murder no matter what, a la Jacobits. The criterion in both approaches becomes maternal rather than fetal. The principle in Jewish law is tsar gufa kadim. Her welfare is primary. Rabbinic rulings on abortion are thus amenable to the following generalization. If a possibility or probability exists that a child may be born defective and the mother seeks abortion on the grounds of pity for a child whose life would be less than normal, the rabbi would decline permission. Since we do not know for sure that it will be born defective, and since we do not know how bad such a defective life will be for the child, and since no permission exists in Jewish law to kill born defectives, permission on those grounds would be denied. If, however, an abortion for the same potentially deformed child were sought on the grounds that the possibility is causing severe anguish to the mother, permission would be granted. Implicit in the Mishnah above, that's our Mishnah, is the teaching that the rights of the fetus are secondary to the rights of the mother all the way up until the moment of birth. This principle is obscured by the current phrase, right to life. In the context of abortion questions, the issue is not the right to life, which is very clear in Jewish law, but the right to be born, which is not as clear. The right to be born is relative. The right to life for existing persons is absolute. Life may begin before birth, but it is not the life of a human person. Animal life, plant life, or even pre-human life are not the same as human life. Rabbinic law has determined that human life begins with birth. This is neither a medical nor a court judgment, but a metaphysical one. In the Jewish system, human life, in this sense, begins with birth. Of course, potential life already partakes of the potential sacredness of actual life, since the latter can have its inception only through the former. Accordingly, and this is the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, Rabbinical Assembly, conservative movement, abortion for population control is repugnant to the Jewish system. Abortion for economic reasons is also not admissible. Taking precaution by abortion or birth control against physical threat remains a mitzvah, but never to forestall financial difficulty. Material considerations are improper in this connection. In the Jewish community today, with a conscious or unconscious drive to replenish ranks decimated by the Holocaust, contemporary rabbis invoke not the more lenient, but rather the more stringent responsa of the earlier authorities. The more permissive decisions, they point out, were in any case rendered against the background of far greater instinctive hesitation to resort to abortion. Against today's background of more casual abortion, rabbis are moving closer to the position associated with Maimonides and Unterman, allowing abortion only for the gravest of reasons. And folks, that's where he wants to end with his own moral message. So he told you that it's about life at birth, to argue with those who had title to life in their halachic literature. Told you it was murder in any case. Gave you the way to understand all the dynamics of the sources and said, we're still going to rule in the most significant cases where there's a danger to the mother, physical, mental, psychological, evil. Didn't use the term evil in our time, but that kind of a reality. We allow this. And please note, there's a framework of Jewish values that we also have to keep in mind as we discuss what our approaches are to individual cases and our policy is within and being part of greater society. And for ourselves, we have our own family of Israel to think of, especially living in the post-Holocaust world. So that's quite a mix of modern statements. Maybe you've heard all of those before, but maybe you've never seen them set against each other. Maybe you've not taken a look at either because we never really sat down to unpack what the approach in terms of the articles about Jewish law really have to speak to us about, to glean from. And I hope that what it did is that at least allowed us a window into the dynamic way that modern halachists read the sources and how these kinds of factors come into play. Not only the texts as factors, but the societal norms and mores as factors within the halachic decision-making processes. History becomes a part of it as well. What are women saying and thinking? What is the situation of Am Yisrael vis-a-vis their experience of living within societies, Europe and America, especially these last two? And what responsibilities do we have to family life? What comes out as deeply troublesome to some poskim for Rabbi Jacobits didn't present as deep a problem. But for us in modernity, who rely on these factors that were brought up in halachic literature, for sure, we have to rely upon not only Rabbi Feldman's permissive stance within the Jewish Committee on Law and Standards, but I would also say, going back to Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg in 1978, around the time that the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is opining and writing its opinions, that we could always hold like he holds in the necessary moment. There is room to be lenient for great need. That is the line that he has. And what is that great need? You would hope that someone would understand deeply what really needs are. He traced it and added the suffering and the pain, not only of the mother, but of the child in the womb or not, because he believes one day, and he was a man that was way before his time, one day we'll be able to assess the feelings of the potential life to be born within the womb. And he made a reference, I believe, within his writings to say, there will be a further time that we will be able to even, quote unquote, speak to the fetus. That will not change the idea that in rabbinic literature, like Rabbi Waldenberg said and Rabbi Feldman asserted, what we've discovered is that Judaism believes life begins, metaphysical life begins at birth. But I wanted you to see the variety of expressions of opinions that exist among and between Orthodox poskim and the kind of positioning that major thinkers within the world of rabbinical assembly took those debates about sources in the 80s that still define our way forward today in the 2020s. My final piece to present will be a small piece from the Talmud, as I said, but I'm going to stop here and ask people for thoughts, reactions, questions, clarification questions, and questions otherwise. Yes, Ron, take your mute off.
Going back to the beginning, when the fetus its head is out and there is complication, and according to the Talmud, the life of the mother take priority. I have a problem with that because we learn in the Talmud that when situation in a triage, in emergency room, the doctors first take care of those who have, there is a terminology called Chayei Sha'ah, which means that they will take care of somebody that have a much longer life into the future than the one that even if they will save him, maybe has an hour or two to live, or a day or a week. So they do not discuss the case if the mother can really survive after the birth, even if they save the child. So that's a gray area for me that they don't discuss, because a lot of women do die while giving birth or immediately after. That's issue number one that I don't know how they deal with it nowadays. Another issue is, although the Jewish people want to preserve life of the fetus or the and life start at the date of birth, but why we need to have the government dictate to the population if a Jewish group want to not to make an abortion, it's a private issue of that Jewish group. Why they need to promote an anti-abortion issue to the general public?
On the latter part, I'm not answering questions about the government, and I'm not answering questions about any assertions of the governmental agencies, other than to say that as a rabbi, I would want from the freedom of religion and establishment clause to be given complete permission to make a religious decision with a member of my congregation about whether or not a termination of a pregnancy is permissible or not. And I have argued from the position that it is a religious freedom issue, an establishment clause issue, that I should be able to, and we should, and any religious organization should be able to, within society, if we enjoy that right and that freedom, to make these calls and to make these decisions, and that it should be allowable safely and securely and what have you. So you're if anybody was wondering kind of where I came down on how Jewish sources inform the policy making decisions of any society in which we live, I would hope for the freedom anywhere in the world for Jews to be able to make that call, because obviously in Jewish life, one posek can disagree with another, one halachic decision maker can disagree with another, but you see there is room for a religious decision to terminate a pregnancy in a particular case that calls for it where there is a need. So that's how I will answer that question, and I don't want to get into a debate about whether or not governments have rights or they don't. I'm just saying that from a rabbinic perspective, that's what I would hope as a practicing rabbi who's asked a question by a congregant. On the other side, how they deal with the gray area of the head is out and what's happening with a woman at the moment where she might really pay with her life, that is an area they dealt with already back thousands of years ago in the Mishnaic era. I would argue that they started dealing with it when there were two different nuschaot of the Mishnah. One that said, when its head is out, we don't touch that now born into the world person. And the other manuscript said rubo, not rosho. The other manuscript said when the majority of that child is out and not just its head. And I think that if you were to have an approach within a certain hospital and they were informed from the ethics board and from rabbanim who are involved in those conversations, because you can't obviously be there at the moment to turn to the jury box of rabbis when you're a doc. We leave that in the medical professionals' hands. But they study such sources as to inform their practice in certain kinds of places. And the distinction between those two is already meaningful in the Mishnah of thousands of years ago. And so I believe that good medical education should really include that shinui nischaot, that study of that Mishnah with the change in manuscripts, which is, believe it or not, like Ismor Shorish used to say, one of the most amazing possibilities of showing people the historical truths of manuscript forms and differences within them, and how it can lead to thinking and practice in terms of the very important elements of the work that people do in the world, including medical professionals. And to me, that's what I would suggest for further education about those issues, because people have to make real game day decisions. Let me take some other questions and comments or thoughts. Dale?
Two comments. Even before Ron raised it, I was sitting here thinking about what could be an American law. How do you create a law with the sensitivity of the sources we've seen, where it's not an abortion on demand, but at least some of them are pretty loose. And the idea that you have to go to a posek to get permission, that there's somebody else who gets final decision, or at least can interact with you to make sure you've thought about it, that's not something we can really replicate. So it gave me a lot of food for thought, as had more so, on many issues like that. The other comment is what struck me about the what was his name, Emmanuel Jacobits, which is the most extreme that we've seen. I can't say I was appalled to find out that there's such an extreme position, but what really bothered me in that was the idea that you look for the rapist to support the child and not to punish the rapist.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that has led in the past, I don't know in the Jewish community, but certainly in general, to forcing a young woman to marry her rapist.
Right, and there are certain approaches like that within criminal justice philosophy. If it wasn't clear, I was kind of reading that as a I can't believe this kind of moment. So I wasn't shocked to find it either, but I really can't say that his position informs my own halachic thinking as I've counseled families one after the other. Unfortunately, even within a liberal rabbinate, if you will, I will tell you all that some people really use the opportunities because they know that Judaism has thought about these matters for so many years to really take up and discuss it. How does that inform policy in America? Well, good counseling, and even here's the part from Jacobits that we can stomach, good teaching about morality and what it means to take responsibility for family and family life. Like, that's the part that I'll take from him, and I'll leave the rest. And I do think a little bit more of that would be helpful in the veins of formulating good policy that's not just policy about, quote unquote, the abortion itself, but what does it mean to educate a society about the value of life and the value of family life and responsibility, but not to say that we agree with the approach. Have to agree with every approach within every halachic responsum. Sheila, I saw your hand. You have to come off mute. I think that's Sheila and not Sam.
She's on mute.
Anyone?
I apologize. I had myself muted. I'm troubled by two issues, and perhaps you can enlighten me. One has to do with Philo Judaeus, or Philo of Alexandria, as you've called him, and that is, since he's taught in mainstream philosophy courses, how much of his approach to this issue is based on his knowledge of Judaism and Jewish law, and how much influence is there based on Greek thinking of the time? Because certainly he was revered by Greek philosophers of his time. That's question number one. And question number two, which really bothers me even more, is this whole issue of what is life and what is murder, and how do you approach the question of abortion. If we accept some of the answers that have been presented, how can we not also make a very strong case for voluntary suicide for people who are suffering from mental anguish or severe physical problems? And I think the one is directly related to the other, but I don't know enough to know how to come to a conclusion on it.
Okay, so about the first one, I definitely would love and would love for us to invite at some point some Philo expert in the world to come and enlighten us more about this man's incredible work over time. So I will just say it with that caveat that for sure I have not done the depth of look at Philo or the research to know exactly his influences and which directions he's coming from, except to say that in this issue, it was said by at least two Rabbanim who read his sources and his commentary that he was, in a certain way, parroting the proto-Christian and early Christian church fathers' interpretation of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, which I showed in the first lecture, was the mistranslation of the Exodus passage that deals with a miscarriage and says, instead of just some disaster occurring and it's still being in the realm of tort law, as to define this distinctively away from a person of person status being killed and therefore it being a capital crime, they went with the notion that if any form to this fetus was discernible, that a capital crime should be charged. And he was going along with that read. And that seems to be because he's into not just what you could say Greek read, but it is the read of the Greek that is the translation of the Bible. And people who read the Bible were interested in the Greek translation because that was the language they spoke. And so he was definitely fluent in that and definitely used that to create his commentaries. Okay, so that is a little bit about that one. On the other hand, there's one approach in the halachic discourse that makes it really easy to answer your question, Sheila, and then there's another approach that makes it a little more difficult. The easy approach is, I could always do a mai shane. In other words, what's different between talking about a potential life and someone about to be born versus someone who's already alive and whose head is out and whose body is out and has been on the earth, and therefore it doesn't fit the category, and that's the difference, mai shane. What's the distinction? So that's the easy answer. It's totally different because one is a potential birth, and born into the world is the beginning of quote unquote metaphysical life, a la Rabbi Feldman, and you're already alive. And if you want to say that there's some challenge to your metaphysical life, it's not the same as being quote unquote, born into the world, out of the womb. If you want to start thinking about these issues as having very related halachic frameworks that help us address matters of life and death, you'd be in good company with people like Rabbi Feldman and Rabbi Dorff and some very dynamic thinkers like Rabbi Berkovitz and a bunch of different Orthodox and conservative thinkers. And we could get more into how they definitely make some distinctions. There's a position within that realm of assisted suicide that is more permissive, even among traditionalists. And there are those who are less permissive because it's someone's life and thou shalt not ever. And the way that you read certain Talmudic sources and the way that you read certain sources about this issue really influence your thinking. And again, in terms of halachic history, I would say the way we should keep studying into the future, and I think I could do a couple of seminars about the assisted suicide issue that would be really interesting, just the same way that I've done this seminar for us this summer. I think that we should read those sources together, because when families come to me and when families want to take it up as a halachic matter, and when families want sources that bring us to that moment of reality in our lives, and we need the mirrors of our sources that are the wisdom for us as Jews, our sages did not back away from really talking about those last days, that last chapter. And this is an area that a lot of people didn't realize was already in the sources. And given technologies today and what we are facing by way of longevity issues, very real. Okay, so I want to leave it at that. And I don't want to say that simple.
I appreciate that, because it really raises those questions. And I didn't expect an answer on the spot, but I think it might be something fascinating to explore.
Good, and I appreciate the suggestion. Diane or Aaron or both?
So, a couple of comments. One is, would hope that there are female poskim or poskiot or who would have an opinion to share on the abortion issue. That's number one. And the other is, the Rabbi Jacobits is some of what he posits is really very difficult to stomach, including his, in 1965, when we were all already talking about zero population growth, to say that it's okay in America. That's one. And then the also the comment about, I guess, replacement of the people we lost in the Holocaust. My mother had told me that, and my parents were married in 1948, that they were encouraged to have more than 2 children in order to try to replace. So that's kind of a side comment, but I think that's all I have to say. It's really.
Rabbi Dorff would agree that you were living a halachic mandate to try to have, more than 2 children. He wrote an article about that as well on the heels of thinking like Rabbi Feldman's, and that did become part of the ethical discussion, the moral mandate of building family and family life. It also became a part of the moral mandate for many to say that if either they had no children or chose not to have children or couldn't, that they were able to contribute to communities of learning and consider those children as if they were under the umbrella of the mitzvah of pru or vu, of having children and expanding the notion of the children of Israel. And so I really loved both of these approaches. And as an educator, would remind people often that when you contribute to Jewish houses of learning, that you are really contributing to those next generation endeavors. The reality too of being a little bit inside halachic sources and being somewhat surprised or finding material distasteful is part of why I wrote the paragraph I did when I advertised the class, that we might encounter opinions within these poskim, but whose opinions matter to us because they are part of the overall history of the halachic discourse that comes to light, and it helps us refine the positioning or the thinking we take. And I think it's important that we not leave them out and deal with difficult texts. As the last note in terms of what you said, here I'm sharing a link in the chat. This is a link to the article by Adina Berkovitz, who is an incredible rabbi and law student, and it's in the Torah Journal of Law, and she will summarize the opinions. And I didn't have permission to cut and paste her article within my source sheets, but I did want to share as one of the last things to say, Diane. So thank you for you teed it up just right. Madam ex-president knows just, I guess, how to get the rabbi in the right slot at the right moment. The notion I wanted to say that there are women writing about this subject. This is a positive article that positions the women possekot and professors in a place of reading these sources with that kind of spirit that other halachits have throughout the centuries. And I think you'll find her article, again, really accessible because of all of the sources we studied together. And I will also say that my colleague and my teacher at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, Dr. Gail Leibovitz, is really combing the Talmud and finding sources that show that women needed to be more of a presence there. And so she'll find the space to say, if a woman had been asked right here, we might have a different story. And also where the woman's voices can be claimed to appear, even though they're not really in the text. And she and my teacher, Dr. Charlotte von Robert, who for a long time head the Jewish Studies Department at Stanford after teaching at Ziegler School, also recover Jewish women's voices from texts. And Dr. von Robert has a book about menstrual purity and all kinds of issues of women's reproductive health in a book that she wrote on the subject. Now, I want to end tonight. It's already 8:42, and I thank you for hanging in there with me for this last session. I want to end tonight by reading to you from the Talmud. I'll just read it to you like a little, lahavdil. It'll be a Jewish bedtime story for us. after this very, very, very deep study of halachic material, we'll go towards the midrash, which is a little bit more like, just lullabies of our rabbis. And I want you to, with this source, let me introduce it by saying, I want you to hear the kind of debate that's going on about the life of the fetus within the mother as a value. And all we do with it afterwards is all this halachic work we did and all the seriousness about life and all the seriousness about women's bodies. But I just want you to listen. It was on today's Daf Yomi. So living with the Talmudic study of Daf Yomi is living with the times, let me just say. And so here is what it says. They're arguing about saying a blessing among a minyan for a wedding, and how you need a minyan for it. And what does Rav Nachman derive from this verse, from which Rabbi Abahu derived the Halakhah that you needed 10 people to say the blessings under the chuppah? He requires the verse to derive that which is taught in a Braita, that is the earliest strata we have of Talmudic literature. Rabbi Meir would say, from where is it derived that even fetuses in their mother's womb sang and chanted the song of the sea when the Israelites crossed together? As it is stated in the chapter of Psalms that describes the Exodus from Egypt, in assemblies, bless God, the Lord, from the source of Israel. If one day we heard the songs of children yet born in the world and they were singing the song of the sea, we would make good on this Talmudic passage, and we would sense that the rabbis were onto really something, that there's a life going on in there. But it does not discount the notion of the Mishnah that said a woman's life took precedence, and how that was applied over the years halachically, and that it was expanded to the notions of physical health, mental health, and even a little sense that it was the right time in terms of her decision making. As we raise the voices of women within our community, I think we will hear more and more of the harmonies between those fetuses, their mothers, and then the fathers and the rest of the family of Israel can chime in. Okay, folks, that's been Jewish Law Seminar for this summer.
Yasher Koach, thank you so
Fabulous.
much.
Yeah.
Just
Thank you. Really good.
Rabbi, are you
Thank
going
you.
to